People always have a fascination with the darker side of things. Recently, an obsession with murder and true crime has risen to astronomical levels. To delve a little bit more into this, we are here in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, at Alcatraz East, at one of the true crime museums. This is Abnormal Voyages. Come tag along. Let's see what we can find out.
We're going to a place that you've never heard of before. It's Abnormal Voyages. You're gonna learn something new. We're gonna open new doors. It's Abnormal Voyages.
As soon as you enter Alcatraz East, there is no question that this place is a jail. Looking around, the jail theme is extremely prevalent. You see all the cells up there, there's a couple of prisoners that have gotten out. It's really cool theming to start off your journey.
We're now inside Alcatraz East, and it's time for our lockdown to begin.
This fictional prison, Alcatraz East, of course takes its name from Alcatraz, a world-famous prison that was on Alcatraz Island, out near California. The real Alcatraz was in use from 1934 all the way up to 1963. The island prison was built to hold the most dangerous of criminals. For as long as there has been societies with rules and laws, there have been people out there willing to break those rules and laws. So of course, there has been lots of different ways to punish or take care of the people who decide to live their lives outside of those guidelines. And one of the more brutal time periods was definitely early on in the Middle Ages.
Punishment was very intense in the Dark Ages. You certainly didn't want to end up on the wrong side of any of these devices.
Throughout the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, that whole period, there were some very brutal ways of taking care of people. The instruments were definitely ones that would not be used today, but back then they had no problem slapping a leather mask on somebody or cutting off different appendages. It was certainly a different time period, but I feel like it was a deterrent for crime for sure. Stockades have always been a very popular crime deterrent, as well as sometimes people getting punished for things they didn't do. The Salem witch trials, a very unfortunate period of time, where literally people were killed for no reason. And you can't have a museum about crime without bringing up pirates. If you saw our amazing journey through the St. Augustine Pirate Museum, you know pirates certainly have a special place in my heart, so I really liked seeing a little bit more about them here in Tennessee. A few of the more famous swashbucklers out there were displayed here with a little bit about them, detailed their crimes on the high seas and things that they did. And the ever-popular knot tying station, where you learned some nautical knots of your own, just in case you're ever out there on a boat and need to tie something off. Here was a popular thing to do to people who broke the rules on the seas. You threw them in the brig. If you look down, you could see this poor guy down there that was all tied up, just waiting for them to get to port so they could take care of him. And a bit on Blackbeard, one of the most popular criminals of all time. These guns were just the type that pirates themselves would use, as well as the daggers and anything that they could kind of have on their body in easy reach. And from pirates, we jumped over to bandits in the Old West. Again, if you've seen our Dodge City adventures, you've seen a little of this kind of stuff, but it was nice getting to see even more of it in the different places outside of Dodge City, as wonderful and exciting as Dodge City was.
What does the phrase, get out of Dodge mean? I think we know the answer to that one.
The Colt 45 was a very popular choice for lawmen of the day, becoming known as the Peacemaker, and it helped against gangs such as the Dalton Brother Gang and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Another popular firearm of the day was the Sheffield revolver. One just like this one here was carried by Wyatt Earp himself. A really interesting artifact that they had on display was in this little case next to the picture of Pancho Villa was his death mask, so you could see what he looked like, I guess, at the time of his death. Very, very different. Unlike the Dark Ages or even the Golden Age of piracy, the Wild West had a lot more pictures and evidence of things that we could look to really get that feel for what it was like back then. There was tons of artifacts that were from different figures. Here's Wyatt Earp's stuff right here. So very similar to Dodge City, we really got that kind of hands-on feel of seeing things that were relevant to those actual days and times. It was fascinating just getting that little glimpse there. And then if you really wanted to feel like you were back in the Old West days, they had a shooting gallery that you could throw a couple of coins in and then take aim and see how you would do out on the frontiers. Considering we were in Tennessee, something that is near and dear to their hearts is their alcohol. Moonshine was a huge industry, not only during Prohibition, but even afterwards. So they definitely had to have some displays of old moonshine equipment. Most interesting, I think, about moonshine is it was one of those crimes that it was illegal, but a lot of people didn't think it was wrong. Even NASCAR actually grew out of the need to quickly get the moonshine from one place to the other without getting caught. It was something that everybody loved, and eventually it just became legal again. Moving on from the Old West, we find ourselves in the early 1900s up through the Depression era, when it seemed like the best way to get some relief was to go straight to the bank and take that money for yourself. Bank robbers of these days, such as John Dillinger, became so infamous that they were basically celebrities. They dressed up to go rob banks. It was a whole ordeal, and the people either loved them or hated them. Somehow, East Alcatraz even had a piece of telephone wire that John Dillinger used to tie up a bank attendant at one of the banks that he robbed. Gangsters and mobsters in general gripped America's imagination, and they all had some pretty interesting nicknames as well. It wasn't long before the names of all these people, such as Machine Gun Kelly and Bugsy Malone, were out there and known by everyone. And as you can find in many museums, they even had a John Dillinger death mask. I gotta say, that's probably one of the most replicated death masks. We've seen it at quite a few places. As the years went by and technology progressed, so did firearms. The submachine gun became a very popular choice for getting a lot of bullets out there really quickly. The Depression certainly drove some people to desperation, so I don't think it's any surprise that there was a spike in crimes and robberies during this time period. John Dillinger was probably the most famous out of this era. They had a lot of artifacts from him, such as this bullet that happened to hit Pretty Boy Floyd, and then the fingerprints of Dillinger, as well as some of his personal artifacts, and some of his writing there, keeping records of things. It's interesting getting to see these different artifacts from people, but part of it is almost sad to think that as soon as they were gone, as soon as they were shot, killed, whatever, people went through their stuff and grabbed it as souvenirs, and now it's in museums. And of course, you can't talk about Gangsters without talking about the one and only Al Capone. These were some items that were made from cherry trees that he specifically grew that were from Japan, and just more artifacts found around him or his club, things that he used. Very fascinating figure, and he actually was in the original Alcatraz. See, yes, here's his picture here, a little bit about the many, many crimes that he committed and reigned over in his day. Al Capone and his gangs and the police were always at odds with each other. Bugsy was kind of Al Capone's number one rival. They were always going at it, trying to one-up each other, take each other out if they could. And one of the things that came from that was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where Al Capone set a trap for Bugsy and his men. His men walked right into it and were slaughtered. Fortunately for Bugsy, he didn't happen to get there on time and got away. But here are some artifacts that were recovered from the scene, including a brick from the actual building where the whole thing went down. Pretty crazy. Al Capone was a pretty well-kept man. He actually had a private hotel suite that he always used. These were some artifacts that were taken from there, some very nice silverware. He fancied himself as a man about town and took care of himself with all that money he was making, even if he was making it in a rather unlawful way. Quite a colorful rogues gallery here, with plenty of gangsters kind of throughout the ages. Different guys, what they did, and their causes of death. Most of them actually died natural deaths, which is surprising considering their line of work. Though the Depression and Prohibition may be far behind us, organized crime and mobs are here to stay. As the times changed and the years went on, the crime families continued what they were doing and just evolved with the times. This case had a lot of memorabilia and artifacts from more modern time ones, not quite our period, but stretching into the 40s, 50s, 60s. Just as things kept going, they kept making money the most profitable way they could. Even in these modern times, it's very appealing to get a lot of cash quick. We move more into the modern era and start with heists. They make for great movie subjects, but heists are a very real and very dangerous threat. Things that are protected can be taken for losses of millions and millions of dollars, such as art piece, historical artifacts, etc., etc. Even Watergate was technically a heist, as they were breaking in to steal something valuable, and in this case, information. It seems a lot of crimes have some conspiracy behind them. One such controversial case was the impeachment of Bill Clinton over his Monica Lewinsky affair. They actually had her handbag here, which was the actual purse that Monica Lewinsky used. Here we have it here underneath a picture of her holding it, and then there's the bag. Was there conspiracy involved with this? Personally, I don't think so. I think it was just a dumb mistake. But here's a ticket to the trial where they argued that very point, and if he deserved to be taken out or not. Of course, there's been a lot of traitors, unfortunately, throughout the ages. These are different people who turned against their country in one way or another, stretching all the way back to the Revolutionary War days, and pretty much coming up to modern day. There's been different traitors in different ways all the way throughout it, such as Bernie Madoff right here. And see some financial crime underneath that, Martha Stewart, the Enron scandal. Lots of ways for people to commit crimes, that's for sure. Fraud is absolutely another big category of crime that you can commit. Again, we see Mr. Madoff and a bunch of supplies and such that came from him. There's his book there. We've got some pictures and articles that were in his office, that were around his house, anything that was kind of taken when they arrested him. Bernie Madoff was sentenced to over 150 years in jail, and he actually ended up passing away while in jail before fulfilling that entire sentence. A rather new crime, cybercrime, has definitely been on the rise. This is using somebody's information, using viruses to grab their bank accounts, catfishing to pretend you're somebody else to get their trust. This has certainly been a huge threat lately, and as more and more of the world turns to being online, it is going to continue to probably be one of the most prevalent crimes that's out there. Gotta stay alert. Theft has always been a very popular crime. Identity theft here, stealing someone's complete identity to take over their bank accounts and such. A very famous thief, D.B. Cooper, who many stories have risen up around. He famously stole millions of dollars and then jumped out of a plane, and nobody has ever seen him again. Here's actually a little scene with him coming out of that plane with the parachute on his back. Did he make it? Is the money still out there? The world may never know. And then one of the most popular crimes, murders. Something about serial killers just captures the imagination. It's something so out there and so horrible that, like a train wreck, you can't look away. This section chronicled the lives, the disturbed minds of these serial killers, and showed you a little bit of who they were and glimpses into their lives. None of it really made sense of why they did the killings that they did. But it was interesting to see the artifacts here, at least. Jeffrey Dahmer is, of course, one of the most twisted individuals possibly to ever live. And the famous Boston Strangler, right along with the Night Stalker. Here we have John Wayne Gacy, who famously was also a birthday clown, so that image of the killer clown really kind of sticks with him. Before he was imprisoned, John Wayne Gacy killed 33 young men and boys. Extremely unfortunate. Here were some artifacts. This was his leather jacket that he wore during a lot of the killings. Though he also did enjoy painting, so there were some paint supplies, a typewriter that did belong to him himself. This was his wallet that was on him at the time that he was arrested, with a couple of his credit cards and membership cards in there. And even a couple of those famous clown suits, which he actually didn't wear when he was doing the killing, but it became so entwined with him that people recognize this right off the bat. This is a self-portrait he did of himself in his clown makeup, and another of his clown suits right here. Extremely creepy to see these in person. Now, like the Zodiac Killer, sometimes killers aren't caught. Nobody knows for sure who they were, and they leave mysteries behind them. The notorious Pizza Bomber had this gun that was shaped to be like a cane, so people couldn't tell that that's what it was. And this actually cuffed around the neck. Right here. A little more about him. And Susan Smith, who actually killed her own children. And of course, Lizzie Borden, one of the first murderers we know about, took that axe, gave her parents 40 whacks. They even included H.A. Holmes, who was the first modern American serial killer. Shootings are always tragic. This was about how a man had climbed the bell tower at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas, and just began sniping people out of nowhere, just shooting them down. This was the actual gun that he had with him in the tower on that fateful day, and one of the bullets that was shot out of it. Ted Bundy has certainly gotten a lot of attention lately, with movies and such being made about him. He was a very prolific killer, and they had quite a few of his artifacts on display here. Pieces from his car, a account of the book that somebody wrote knowing him, and a handwritten letter by Ted Bundy himself. Charles Tex Watson was a member of the Charles Manson family. Made his fingerprints on display here. He continues to serve his life in prison right now. This knife belonged to the Boston Strangler, and the jewelry here are pieces that he made while he was in jail. The Chicago's World Fair. This is where H.H. Holmes did his killing in a special hotel made specifically to help murder and dispose of bodies. Very scary. And Charles Manson, who used his charisma to brainwash people into committing crimes for him. Though he may not have killed anyone personally, he's definitely got a lot of blood on his hands. But this here was his guitar that I suppose he played in his downtime when he wasn't convincing people to do his bidding. Edward Gein was a murderer, and for some reason, they had his tooth here on display. I don't know how they got it or why, but there you go, in case you wanted to see what a serial killer's tooth looked like. Aileen Wuornos proved that murder was not just a men's game. This was her fingerprints here when they booked her. She continued to say that her murder was self-defense. Kidnapping is one of the worst things you can do. This was examples of some famous kidnappings throughout the years. All very, very sad stories personally. Really hard to look at some of this stuff just knowing that these people lost their children, going all the way back to the Lindbergh baby, which of course was a very famous case that was never fully solved. And explaining Stockholm Syndrome, where somebody is kidnapped and eventually ends up wanting to stay with the person that kidnaps them. A very unusual psychological condition. There were some old missing children advertisements, things people used in desperate attempts for anyone with information to help them get their child back. And then Adam Walsh. This was a fascinating story of the host of America's Most Wanted. Before he did that, he actually was just a father who his son went missing. And that eventually turned into the TV show that everyone knows now as America's Most Wanted. Unfortunately, his son wasn't found alive, but I like to think that the show did go on to help thousands of other families. Mass shootings are, of course, another very sad section of history. It started out with the DC Beltway sniper. You get to see a little bit about that, the victims. You could hear somebody talking about being there at these shootings. Columbine High School shooting was a very, very sad event. I can't even fathom what goes through someone's mind to think this is an okay thing to do, what drives someone to bring a gun into a public location like this. You'll notice a lot of these are schools, which makes it all the much sadder. For any of these, you could hit the button and hear a little bit about what happened there, either from one of the survivors, from somebody reporting from the scene. It was all heartbreakingly sad, the things that these people saw and had to go through. Coupled with this, we had a display that had some different artifacts. There was the music festival that took place in Las Vegas. Different things left from that, including this hat with a bullet hole straight through it. Don't even really want to think about that too much. These were other artifacts found there or left for people on the memorial sites. Here were some artifacts and a yearbook from the Columbine High School, the day of the shooting there. And even a backpack that one of the students had used as a shield during the shooting. And this was a movie ticket from the Aurora Theater where the shooting happened during the showing of The Dark Knight Rises. and then a little of the shooting in Orlando, Florida, at the nightclub. Sometimes the killing isn't senseless, though, and it's thought-out political assassinations. Of course, the most popular of which, by far, Abraham Lincoln and other presidential figures that have been mowed down while they were in office. Sometimes the targets may not be presidents themselves, but still done for different political reasons and such. This is a death mask of Martin Luther King Jr., who of course was the figurehead of the civil rights movement. Here's some more pictures from the different killings and such of things that happened. JFK is probably one of the most controversial assassinations ever, and this was different artifacts from that about Lee Harvey Oswald and all of the events of that day, which honestly could very much be a voyage of its own. Lots of things to talk about there. Here was more about the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, who was the president's brother, of course, and then assassination attempts that people tried to kill them. It just didn't quite stick. Most of these are presidents. Those are the ones that people went after and couldn't get the job done. Thankfully, of course. Bombings are, of course, a horrible crime that people can commit that really ties in with other terrorism of all different kinds. This is different terrorist groups and artifacts from those terrorist organizations, and a little bit about some of the terrible things that terrorist groups have carried out throughout the years. There was even a medal from the Boston Marathon where the bombings happened. You saw that big picture of the Oklahoma City bombing. Very unfortunate things, and this is the kind of stuff that we want to try to make sure never happens again. Terrorism just doesn't accomplish anything at all. The Unabomber was, of course, a well-known criminal figure. This was a replication of his shed, where he spent his time in solitude away from people and planned out his next gruesome attack and sent bombs out to people. It's a very twisted individual who would do something like this for sure. Moving on, every crime has a crime scene. This was really neat where you could push the pictures and kind of get highlighted the different things that they look for when they're coming into a crime scene for the first time. Sometimes cases can't be solved right away, and they of course become a cold case. These were a few famous cold cases that people would be aware of. Tupac and Biggie, who murdered them, what happened to John Benet Ramsey, Amber of the Amber Alert fame. Then we also had the Black Dahlia, one of Hollywood's biggest mysteries. They showed you a bit of what crime documentation looks like and the ways that they went about just documenting what happened, what was there, and making sure not to lose any of those clues. This had some typical items and showed you the ways they could shine different UV lights on them just to see if there was any traces of fluids or any human things there, blood, stuff like that. And much like the guns we saw earlier, photography has also advanced throughout the years. This was an old-timey kind of CSI kit, as you can tell, very outdated. And this was a more modern one of what you could see nowadays if you were out on the streets when a crime happened. This is what you could expect them to bring to document it. CSI TV shows have, of course, made a lot of this kind of common knowledge, but a lot of people don't know what really goes on in the processes of trying to figure out how things were done, how they tracked down killers using all these little clues. So this just tried to show you a little more of the science behind all of it and what was actually happening, and not just what you see over on TV. They even had a little lab set up so you could experiment with a bit yourself. Here's a body that was laid out for an autopsy. You were able to go through and find different things that people doing an autopsy would key in on to get more information. Then you could move over to look at the different tools they used when they dissected the bodies. You could look at fingerprints and figure out the different loops and arches. Toxicology taught you what they were looking for when it came to checking the body for poisons or anything that may have caused the death unnaturally. This is a Geiger counter where you could circle through pieces of mail and find out if there was any radiation lingering on it. And this was a Fields narcotics kit that you could take out to swipe things and just see if there was anything on it that might be useful when trying to figure out what happened to a dead body. Ballistics was pretty fascinating. They took you and showed you the different impact zones of a bullet hole and how you could use that to match up and figure out exactly what kind of bullet shot, where it came from, and really get as many clues as possible just from learning about the bullet. This went into the history of ballistics a little bit and showed you the different tools that they used throughout the decades of keeping the bullets contained, finding out the trajectories, and just kind of what they did. Dental has always been a very important factor when it comes to identifying someone, a body, and figuring out who exactly it is. So this spotlighted that a bit and showed you the different things that they look for in being able to process and figure out who someone is. This was especially useful if the body no longer had fingerprints from fire or being cut off or anything like that. And then we ended this section with the morgue, where the bodies were stored and kept until they needed to be used or sent off for funerals. Once CSI did their job, it was only a matter of time before most criminals were caught. And of course, once you're caught, the next step is to get your day in court. Polygraph tests are a really useful tool that courts use to try to sniff out the truth in a situation, find out what really happened somewhere. Here were some famous duos that had their chance in court. We had a judge's robe here, very fancy looking, and then a little bit about the Casey Anthony trial, which was very, very popular, and some pieces of evidence that were shown in that trial, as well as the gavel of the judge who reigned over that. And after the trial, usually the criminals found themselves in jail, which is not a place anybody likes to find themselves, that's for sure. Most of this section was different artifacts that were found in jail cells throughout the years, throughout the country, different ways that people had of keeping prisoners in line, different weapons that were found on inmates that they had to take away from them, and just showing off the different ways that cells looked back then. Like everything else, even prison has evolved to kind of keep up with the times. Prison tattoos are very popular. With this, you could lift these up and see what the meaning was behind these possible prison tattoos. And this was Al Capone's prison cell. It was a replica of what he had, and honestly, his prison cell looked better than some apartments I've seen. He may have been in jail, but he was still living in style. This was a more modern and regular prison cell for anybody who wasn't Al Capone. This is what you could expect pretty much today if you ended up in jail, which hopefully you don't. And this was a secret little escape tunnel here. You could climb through and see if you fit through the air ducts. And for those who prison simply wasn't enough for the heinous crimes they committed, we did have an entire section of capital punishment where they ended up losing their lives. This has, of course, been something that's been done to people who break the law pretty much ever since laws have been around. If you broke it too much, they just killed you. This is a ducking stool, which is a particularly brutal way to kill someone. You'd sit in the chair, and they would literally dunk you repeatedly until they decided just to let you drown. Of course, being burned at the stake, beheading. Talked about those a little bit earlier with the Dark Ages stuff, and it was very much present here. There's the guillotine herself, nice and sharp, ready to take some heads off. An estimated almost 17,000 died by the guillotine during the Reign of Terror. Oof. Firing squad was another popular way some people went, especially during war. And here was an electric chair. Not a chair you'd like to find yourself in, that's for sure. Here was a control panel that actually 2 people had to use to be able to use the lethal injection. And a gas chamber. Another chair that you definitely don't want to find yourself in. Moving on, we found ourselves in the garage, where they had this amazing artifact here. This is the actual VW Beetle of Ted Bundy. This is John Dillinger. Not his actual car, but a replica of one of the cars that he used back in those days. It's actually a very nice, fancy-looking car. Not bad looking at all. I love the color on it. And then this is the actual Ford Bronco that O.J. Simpson made his famous chase with. This is it, right here in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Speaking of O.J. Simpson, there was not a lack of artifacts on him. This controversial case has always been in the public mind, and they had plenty of things here talking about that fateful case and what happened that night. And then they wanted to make you aware of a crime that you could actually be a part of and not even know it. Counterfeiting. If you don't buy your stuff straight from the source, you may not know that what you're buying is a counterfeit. Though I'm not sure who's out there buying counterfeit Legos and chili lights, it's apparently something that happens. Here were some examples of a regular item versus a counterfeit one, just so you could see how some of them actually looked very much like the real deal. But in other cases, there were sometimes ones that didn't really sell people on that being the right item, such as some of these here just looked a little silly, to be honest. I think that my favorite was the Super Mario 64 Nintendo game on an Xbox case. That was really good. The Winnie instead of the Wii. It was just comical how bad some of these knockoffs were, but other ones were pretty convincing. Here was another whole set of counterfeit things. One of those Tweety birds looks terrible. One of those Angry Birds looks really bad. But again, some of them didn't look half bad and could almost be believed to be an actual item. People always seem interested when celebrities are the targets of crime, so they made sure to have a display here with some of the pop culture crimes. Selena, Michael Jackson, the assassination of John Lennon, all of it had a little bit here. It was very interesting to see. There were some crimes related to sports and different artifacts owned by people, such as OJ. This was his golf clubs here. They had a towel about Michael Vick when people were very upset with him about the dog fighting, rightfully so. And then a display that I thought was very amusing, which covered the ever-popular Tiger King, something that captured a lot of people's interest during quarantine. Here were items all involving the Tiger King, including a tiger ball that was donated by the Big Cat Sanctuary. What drives somebody to crime is something that we may never know, but I think it's safe to say it certainly makes for an interesting museum. Well, my name is David, and this has been Abnormal Voyages. Thanks for tagging along. We'll see you in the next one. After all that crime talk, we crossed the waters and ended up on an island with a very, very special and unique restaurant like no place you've ever seen before. So take a load off and join us to check out the one and only Bubble Room. We'll see you there.